Let's say that these are our regular research centers, which are on Thursdays usually, and next Thursday we have Alexander Bonchenko, the director of the Teaching Education for Market Education. And now I'm very glad to present Mrs. Simona, the head of education, and we'll speak about livelihood analysis of the untitled, and we will also have bigger in 2 weeks section, in 2 weeks, and he will speak in the policy seminar also about UNICEF experience in Ukraine.
All right, well, good afternoon and thanks for finding the time. I'll do a quick introduction of myself, and it will be good to have a brief about you and your expectations from this seminar, and then we can move on. So, my name is Grigor, I'm head of mission with MSF, Doctors Without Borders. The abbreviation you will see everywhere is in French, and some from here, but it's Doctors Without Borders. I have been in Ukraine since June last year, but it's over 10 years that I work with the organization. I've worked in Kyrgyzstan, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, and now in Ukraine. And by training, I have a training in international law and diplomacy with a specialization of humanitarian systems. Okay? So it would be good, a few words if you could tell what about you, introduce and expectations you will have from the seminar, and I'll try to cover the expectations that you have, even though I have a presentation ready in advance. We'll see how much it matches each other. Okay. Well, let's start from you. Familiar face.
My name is Anastasia. I also work with MSF, so probably it wouldn't be fair to say some expectations. However, I would like to know more about the theory of humanitarian assistance, because we do some practical exercise here. It would be good to know some background for you.
Okay.
My name is Zarina. I'm a political scientist. I studied in Sciences Po Bordeaux and the College of Europe. And now I'm in Kiev, and I'm still interested in all issues connected to political science and so on. So yeah, maybe for me it was interesting to hear your experience, and yeah, you're Armenian, I love Armenia very much. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Nicola, and I'm a PhD student. So basically I'm interested in this topic, and actually I want to know more about your organization and actually practical experience, especially in Ukraine.
Okay. We'll try to cover both interests of theory and practice. We go to you.
My name is Igor, and I think this topic is highly sensitive and interest for me and for Ukraine.
Yes.
And I would like to get more information, more detailed maybe information about the mission.
My name is Ilona, I work at TUC, and I'm as a researcher, I'm interested in the research of all this stuff.
And thank you, Ilona, for organizing it. It was Ilona who managed to put together this event. Thanks a lot.
My name is Anastasia. I'm unemployed right now, but I have a background in sustainable development in agriculture. But I'm also interested in all issues of international development. And I know in Ukraine there are a lot of projects who work in humanitarian response. So I'm also very interested in their work and in the work of Doctors Without Borders.
Humanitarian action and development will discuss on where the border is, where the humanitarian assistance stops and the development work starts. This is one of the things we'll address.
Yes. My name is Katerina. I'm a social scientist, and I focus on studying the displaced population and the population which stay there where they are, during the conflict. I think the most probably interesting thing in your lecture might be is the methods of analyzing people who live in the conditions of the life of the war conflicts,
Okay.
specifically the economic strategies, how to study them.
All right. We'll speak about it when discussing livelihoods and how the livelihoods are affected in the context after armed conflict.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm working as independent consultant, mostly on legal issues and international development. Previously worked more with international technical aid and civil society organizations who are working with areas under armed conflict, but now working more with private sector, with agricultural businesses and also social enterprises. So interested also in such issue as what is the role of private sector in ensuring livelihood of territories under armed conflict, and what is the role in humanitarian aid.
Okay. I hope we can cover it. There is a part that we discuss private sector, there is a part we discuss agriculture, but we'll focus more on the role of the humanitarian workers.
Thank you.
My name is Olga. I teach here at KC and also work as a consultant to developing ILO, and I'm interested in the topic from the point of view of the impact of conflict on migration of people and labor market, that I did a study for the ILO on the employment needs of internally displaced people.
All right, thank you.
I'm Maxim Abrizan, I'm assistant professor here at Key School of Economics. I'm a scientist, I do research on Donbass in particular, so I looked at the stone coupe, I looked on how happiness changed. So as a scientist, I'm always looking for new data sources and collaboration. So if there's some good data source I don't know about Donbass, I'll be happy to. I'll be happy that I'm here.
All right. I tried not to focus very much on Ukraine, but use other examples.
Okay.
But of course, not to be naive that there will be parallels drawn to our reality here. Okay.
My name is Olga. I'm a research associate at Key School of Economics. I'm also very interested, as everybody here, very interested in the topic, and also from the first source and from the person who is familiar,
Thank you.
and also in other countries. It's very interesting.
Anya?
Hi, I am from SF. I'm communication officer. So yeah, I would like to also to hear, to listen something interesting about not Ukrainian, about other countries.
All right, thanks. Welcome. All right, we have just started introductions, and if you could introduce yourself, please. All right. Okay, welcome. All right, so what we will do is you already received the agenda of what we are going to do. I know some of the concepts we hear a lot about humanitarian assistance, about protection, about development, but I wanted to bring some clarity on what we are exactly talking about, because I noticed that we very frequently use the same terminology, but we mean different things. So there is a bit of a glossary to understand what we mean. Regarding language, if there are any questions or I speak fast, none of us is a native speaker here, so understanding each other might be a bit of a challenge, but please don't hesitate to interrupt. And as it's not a very large group, it's okay also during presentation if you want to interrupt and ask some questions, you're welcome. I'll try to cover the points that you had, and most of them are included here. But if there is something else, we will have 20 minutes at the very end for discussion and exchange of opinions. All right? So first we will speak about the humanitarianism in 21st century. What are the main trends, concepts, objectives, limitations of humanitarian action, and we'll finish with livelihoods. So we'll allocate less time to the first 2 points and more on the analysis, because this was a seminar more focusing on analysis. But it would be good to give a bit of a broad. So ICRC is the first organization, first officially humanitarian organization. It was ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, who started. And then it was before the First World War, and the role of humanitarian action was to give treatment. The first way it started was to treat the wounded patients, because there was nobody to treat the wounded patients in the conflict. So there was a need for having impartial, independent, neutral individuals who would do the work. So the roots of a humanitarian movement, non-civilian humanitarian movement, go back to religion, but afterwards it was the ICRC that set the foundation for humanitarian work. And of course, afterwards, the main big events, the First World War and Second World War, emphasized the need of impartial humanitarian action that has an objective to treat or to reach out to those affected by armed conflict, and to provide a neutral, impartial, independent assistance to the ones who have suffered the conflict. We're speaking mostly about civilians, but we're speaking also about the combatants. But throughout time, humanitarian work has changed a lot. So in the beginning, it was few organizations. Now we have very many organizations. It has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, humanitarian work. MSF itself has $1.5 billion annual circulation. Similarly, ICRC, and if we speak about bigger organizations such as UN, that it has become a big industry that is functioning globally. So the bigger it is, the more changes and the more bureaucracy and the more infrastructure that comes along it. And there are big trends in recent, starting from Iraq conflict, which was a turning point of conflict against the terror, because the terror is not a third, it's not a party you directly address. So war against terror started by the United States Bush administration, changing the concept of humanitarianism. So what are the main things that we notice today? These are the politicization of humanitarian action. And as you mentioned, it's a very sensitive topic in Ukraine to speak about the conflict and to speak about the humanitarian action, but Ukraine is not the exception. Humanitarianism is very politicized because it's the political parties, it's the government, it's the administrations that give money to humanitarian action. So there is interdependence of what you do and what you say about the donor who paid to deliver humanitarian aid. We have militarization. Case of Afghanistan, winning hearts and minds of Afghan people. When humanitarian assistance became attached to military attacks. So war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, when they started, the Pentagon budget that was to facilitate the armed conflict, it had a component of humanitarian assistance. So, and in many cases, it's the military who also delivered the humanitarian assistance. So the militarization of humanitarian work became the new trend, and it has become a norm by now. So if in 2015 we would speak about the new trends in humanitarianism, I think in 2019 we can say it's a norm, because you can see in many places military running humanitarian hospitals, military doing food distributions, military providing shelters, free passages, etc. Humanitarian aid under attack. This is a very sensitive issue again, because as I mentioned before, there were very few humanitarians in the fields, now there are more. So it's difficult to compare the proportionality, but you hear humanitarian workers being targeted, schools being targeted, hospitals being targeted, health facilities, and individual doctors, individual nurses being targeted. We'll come to why it's important to target to target humanitarians, and why it's important not to do it as well. The legal environment, and we'll speak about the war against, the Patriot Act, which is to forbid financial support to terrorists. The case was a very outstanding case in Somalia. We'll discuss how funding has been stopped to Somalia because under pre-assumption that the food distributed by World Food Program goes to Al-Shabaab terrorist groups. So by cutting humanitarian aid, are we punishing Al-Shabaab or are we punishing the population who lives on the soya beans that is being shipped there? So there is this legal framework that is also dictating on where the humanitarian aid is going nowadays. And drawing the line between humanitarian aid and development, a point that was raised here. This is a very fluid space. Humanitarian assistance, when we say, we refer more frequently to emergency response, but when the emergency stops being an emergency and it becomes a development activity, this is very debatable. And it's debatable not as much in the eyes of the patients or the beneficiaries, but it's more debatable in the eyes of donors who decide to allocate money to assistance or who decide to allocate money to development. So depending on this, much changes, because in the eyes of a person who has lost the house, the emergency hasn't stopped while the new house is being built. But for the donors and the organizations, it is two various topics and two different pots to use the money for. Okay? So this is the example of the militarization. Winning hearts and minds. There was even a big article in Afghanistan where humanitarian aid was distributed by military, and it was distributed in some cases in exchange for information. It was distributed in exchange for certain services. Mm-hmm. This is, again, becoming a common practice. At least the fact that it's distributed by military is becoming the norm. If it's being exchanged, it is being distributed in exchange for recognition. In YouTube, it became a big thing when the case of Syria, when the distribution of water, everybody who would receive the water would have to recognize the president being Bashar al-Assad. So this was one of the cases that how humanitarian aid is given to population in exchange, in recognition, bribing, or just buying the trust. There was a very interesting article for Afghanistan, Buying Hearts and Minds, when humanitarian aid was given to recognize the US invasion as not only the invasion, but to recognize it as freeing the population from Al-Shabaab, so Al-Qaeda. So there is this thing of militarization. It is a common practice you see in other places also the use of military hospitals as health posts or military helicopters, military planes as mediums for humanitarian assistance. It is bad also from perspective of international humanitarian law because military are targetable. So being a military facility, it is not illegal to target the military facility. So merging of these two becomes a problem. Mm-hmm. The other aspect of militarization is when military is used as a security. In different contexts, some humanitarian organizations use military, so armed escorts, armed compounds. So this also makes the humanitarian organizations targetable. Targeting humanitarian organizations, hospitals, health facilities. We have increased number in Afghanistan again, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Ukraine as well. The cases have been recorded when health facilities are being the target of a military operation. If I use from my experience in South Sudan, how it changes the situation. So if the village has a maternity where all the women go to deliver and where all the children get vaccination, so you want to organize displacement of population. We spoke about displacement today. All you need to do is you bomb the hospital and you bomb the food distribution points. So the community, you don't have to kill everybody. The community will automatically move somewhere else. When they don't have the first commodities, you organize displacement of population in a very smooth way. But at the same time, the mortality increases. This is an example in Afghanistan again, when MSF Hospital, the only trauma hospital in the region, in Kunduz. I don't know if you remember, it was from 2 years ago or 3 years ago right now, when MSF Hospital has been bombed up with all the patients and staff inside it. Again, it's one example. In Yemen, unfortunately, it's happening on regular basis. In other places, you have as well targeting of welfare centers, FAPs, or targeting of hospitals, or forcing humanitarian organizations not to go there, health facilities to close down. Same goes for schools. We have examples when youth migrates from one place to another. When you ask, why did you move? They will say, because there is no place for children to go to school. So this can be a tool to facilitate, manipulate the situation when you organize a forced migration. So it can be a very systematic, well-planned, intelligent tactics of movement of people and increases mortality, reduces the literacy, etc., etc. Legal environment. Our neighbor here in Hungary, they criminalized last year assistance to refugees. And it's not only giving assistance, it's also giving advice to the refugee where you can find assistance. So if I tell a refugee that this is a legal center, legal department or lawyer that can give you advice on how to file your papers for refugee status, it is a criminal liability for me.
In Hungary?
Hungary was one of the countries that pushed for it. A bigger example is when Italy criminalized docking of Aquarius. This was SOS Mediterranean and MSF working together. It was a rescue ship, the objective of which was patrolling in Mediterranean Sea. And when they would see the refugees in small boats, they would just dock them and bring to Greece or bring to European ports. So Italy pioneered the legal process of criminalizing, of not allowing the boats, the ship, it's a big one, to board, to dock in Europe. So Aquarius, no more functions. But you can create legal constraints that prohibits humanitarian work to take place. And when we speak about protection, we'll understand what it does to the populations in terms of protection. They don't mean military protection.
Can I ask one question about this one, about the legal environment? As far as I know from this case, it's like not a direct anti-humanitarian law. It's just the way they use the already existing law.
They revoked the license
Yeah, but
to
they
be
justified it by a non-correct way of waste disposal, something like this. So, but are there countries where they would create special anti-humanitarian laws?
Hungary was one example, and I'm sure Hungary is not.
Like
I'm sure Hungary is not the only one. Yes, Hungary is not the only one. It's just more striking because it's happening in Europe. But I'm very sure you have mostly when it comes to immigration, searching for refugee, asylum-seeking rights, healthcare rights. These are the things that by juridical power you can hinder, at least. Anti-terrorist legislation. This is something that we're familiar, and it started with the war against terror. So when the war against the West launched by terrorist organizations, the answer to a war against Western values, etc., was an answer to war against terror. So it's not personalizing a country or a group. And war against terror came with its consequences. US being the biggest and largest donor of humanitarian aid, was very influential to run this legislation. And World Food Program, which is a UN agency working on food security or food insecurity, food distribution is their main function, they get cut lots of funding. And Somalia was the first example that by distributing food in Somalia was seen as, are you assisting terrorists? Because by humanitarian law, there is also this concept of being direct participant or indirect participant of hostilities. So terrorist is not a full-time job. You can have your opinions, you can fight at night and can be a father during the day. So if you are entitled for the food ration, humanitarian assistance, giving the family a food ration, are you assisting a terrorist or are you punishing the family? The problem is, during the next time I will speak here, it's about gender in conflict. We will see that this way or another it will be the women and children who will suffer, because you punish the terrorists by not giving food, or you don't punish, it will not be the fighters who will lose it, it will be the women and the children who will bear the consequences of it. And it's a dilemma. For the case of MSF, we are an independent organization. We don't take money from big donors, including big countries, the US government. So we can afford having a direct discussion, negotiation with Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, and deliver humanitarian assistance. However, the Patriot Act would require that even any communication with terrorist organizations or individuals under terrorist watch lists, you would have to either declare and get a waiver in advance from the government, or it would also bear criminal liability. So this was a big factor that hindered humanitarian access of who you can help and who you cannot help. And it's very easy to call somebody a terrorist, which has very serious legal and humanitarian consequences. Very good example that we see right now is the Kurdish group in Syria. Turkey sees it as terrorists, and if they are a terrorist, they are targetable. So, or you help them, you give them assistance, or you don't give them assistance. So the name terrorist is very strong, and it has big implications which have humanitarian consequences. And this is from 2015. If I say the numbers have changed, but the picture hasn't. I couldn't find anything more reliable from you where the humanitarian money comes from. The first donor we have is the United States. We have Germany, UK, France, Japan, Sweden, Netherlands, etc., etc. So what do we have in common here is that the first top donors, they are all coming from the Western world, and they represent the Western bloc. So if there is an anti-terrorist legislation which is being run, all of them will be on board. And if all of them are on board, which means money going a direction, gets completely cut. So it's quite monopolized. We have also, we say, newly emerging donors or new donors or non-traditional donors, which is not the right word to say. And this is the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey is one of the growing donors, China. But all these donors have humanitarian money as a part of either their budget of military or as a part of the budget of foreign affairs, which means you do humanitarian assistance as a part of your foreign policy to get acceptance, to get access to local markets. So if you donate for development in a country few $1 billion, then you also monopolize the markets in a way. You get a minimum, you get big access to the markets. So this is a very important and a tricky fact that humanitarian money that comes, it also dictates a lot of conditions. And how the international organizations can maneuver the situation, this is a big problem. Okay? So the big debate that we have is if humanitarianism is addressing consequences or the causes. No, symptoms or the causes. What do you think? Let's think about war in Iraq. Not to make it more sensitive, it's a past. War in Iraq, the role of humanitarian organization, what is it? Was it a fair war? Was it just to invade Iraq? What do you think?
I mean, it depends. It depends. It's like, it depends which stand do you take. Do you take the stand of Iraqis or do you take the stand of US?
If you take the stand of Iraqis, it's invasion, occupation. If you take the stand of US, it's free invade.
It's hard to say how much truth is in fact that there are so many terrorists.
Okay.
And that's subject to manipulation, right? It's the way how you present the facts.
Okay. Other opinions?
Well, if you are talking about people, it doesn't matter basically. The people suffer consequences.
So
they are not involved in the actions.
So we are speaking about consequences, yes? And as you said, it depends on the stand. So it's very important that humanitarians don't take a stand. Because when you take a stand, if it was a fair war or unfair war, you're losing half of the population, or half of the population has losing the chance to get access to health services, food, humanitarian assistance, access to mobile. And there is a debate around it as well. If the role of humanitarian world is to target the cause, which is more about human rights when we speak, or the role of humanitarian assistance is to target the symptoms. By targeting the symptoms, how much bad we are doing, because by targeting the symptoms, you don't change anything at the same time. But at the same, what is important is MSF's perspective, and I'm representing MSF, is we target the symptoms. As tempting as it may be to know whose fault is it that the war started, be it in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Iraq, wherever, the function of humanitarian organization and the objective is to alleviate the suffering of an individual now. That's why we say also humanitarian assistance is about emergency response, it's not about the development planning. Mm-hmm. So if somebody needs assistance today, and in my career, sometimes I had the frustration thinking, okay, what are we really doing? Because we treat this patient, the patient goes out, gets shot again, and comes back to the hospital. Or how many times you can treat the same child with malaria, that the 5th time the child dies. If you don't do anything bigger, and you don't invest in prevention, and if you don't invest in building health infrastructure. But the function of humanitarian still stays to address the symptoms. And we'll say why.
How about humanitarian interventions? When you intervene directly to the, to the situation, is it the part of the humanitarianism? It is.
The part of the wisdom is to intervene when it's most needed. So even during armed conflict, there is humanitarian work on the ground as much as you have access, as much as you have resources. Funding is a factor that dictates on what to do, because if you have the money to be reactive and to go very fast, then you are on spot quicker. Most of humanitarian organizations depend on the funding, which means if a war started, you have to write a project proposal, you have to get an approval, go and buy things to come and implement. International Committee of Red Cross, NSF, that have the reserve funding, they can be more reactive than certain organizations. Bigger organizations can be more or less more reactive. The smaller organizations would really have to wait to get the money to go back to do something. We try to be there, but how far you want to judge the rights and wrongs, it is in a way a humanitarian suicide, because you express an opinion and there are no right opinions. Every opinion is wrong. You cannot take positions when you have belligerents present. And I found a very interesting quote on the belligerents. So when there is cooperation with one belligerent, you lose the other parts of, because it's a conflict, it's a very emotional environment, it's not a very rational environment. So when you have cooperation with one belligerent, and Iraq, in the reading materials I sent out, there is the Torrente discussing why there shouldn't be cooperation with the belligerent. Because when you're taking American money and you're speaking loudly about human rights violations by Saddam's government, times have changed. It turned out there were lots of violations. It turned out there were rights and wrongs more than what we thought. There is a question of credibility of these organizations who are saying that there is mass violations of human rights on this. So they were tabloiding, they were promoting one side of the opinion. Times change and the positions also change. So you lose credibility to operate in the same place. My opinion is really, it is a professional suicide when you take a side of this or that party. And as a part of humanitarian principles, there is neutrality and impartiality that we try to deliver on both sides of the conflict. You always have IDPs. We spoke about internally displaced people here. We spoke about refugees. But when you have a refugee situation, you always have a host community. So if you deliver services only for the refugees in this country, that the host community doesn't have access to the same services, you create inequality, you create a conflict. So even this is not the two sides of the thing, but you can create two sides if you don't deliver impartial and equal services to everybody. It is an opinion. Some organizations think that while there is money, you should always take it. It's called Wilsonian School of Humanitarianism, that think that if there is money and you can treat a child, why not to take this money and treat this child? So what if it's opinionated money, so what, it comes with strings attached. So if there is an opportunity, treat as many people as possible, instead of refuse it. In Rwanda, MSF refused to stay there, because if you would stay there, you would have to take sides. And if you take sides, some other organizations stayed. So it is an institutional positioning for our organization to ensure that we provide neutral, impartial assistance. If we cannot, even if the needs are very high, we prefer to leave, rather than help only one side of it. I attached 2 readings. It's very theoretical. If you are interested, you can browse through to form your own opinion. I will not continue promoting MSF's opinion on it. Okay? And finally, we go back to our main topic, which is what happens to populations when there is armed conflicts. So for this, there is this big mechanism. It's a reading, it's a framework from DFID. It's a British Commonwealth Humanitarian Wing funded project. So what do we need to know when there is no conflict and how the conflict impacts? So we'll discuss today only these two parts, which is what are the livelihood assets and what are the structures and processes. And then we'll see how all of this gets affected, transformed, and have time now. How all of this gets transformed, and we assess vulnerability. Okay? So first of all, we speak about the pyramid of assets. Assets is what you have. Okay? What you have and what you need to run a normal life. So this is a framework which gives a theory of measuring also the vulnerabilities. And it will answer to many of your questions regarding migration. What happens when people migrate, forced migration, they become IDPs. So you can see how these assets change. So we see 5 main assets. So it will be human capital, it will be financial, it will be natural, it will be social, and physical. So basically what we need to run our lives are all these assets. Financial assets. If I have savings in my life, this guarantees some stability for some period of time. So if I lose my job today, or if conflict starts and my organization closes, I don't work anymore, I have some financial savings. So these are the financial assets. What other financial assets you can bring? As an example. In the field of finance, what do you need to run your life?
Savings?
Savings, yes. Where do you keep the savings? In the bank. You have your credits. You have your banks. You have your credit cards. You have your loans. You have your pensions. You have your investments. So these are the financial assets, like the money that you have. And when you have a conflict, you lose your card at least. The banks close, go bankrupt. You lose your pension because there is no more pension. Or the money you invested can disappear. So these are all the things that can happen to you when there is a shock. So this is the financial. And let's say we're very good and we have it here. Natural assets. What natural assets do we see? Land. Agricultural land. Okay, yeah. What?
This property refers to financial assets, also natural assets.
Or physical.
Any kinds of property like
Physical
house,
assets.
physical assets.
But land is a natural asset. But apart from land, if we think outside the context of Ukraine, in Darfur, charcoal, which is the grass that people go every day to collect, to burn, to cook their food. This is a natural asset. Having oil is a natural asset, or it's a natural curse. Other natural resources, because if you have a huge mining company where half of the town works in the mining company, the company is affected. This is a natural asset that also impacts the whole infrastructure of what's happening around. Human assets. which is the most important. We should have started here. What are the human assets we have? And let's think not only as individuals, but also think as communities. Our family members, which is a workforce. If you have 5 family members in the age of 20-30, which means you have 5 people that can work. And if you lose some of them, you have less people bringing income into the house. If you have a teacher in the village, because if you lose your teacher in the village and there is no school in the village, people will have to migrate to somewhere where there is a school. Moreover, if it's a health worker, who is the pillar of the society, and if the health worker migrates or if the health worker dies in the conflict, it affects the whole infrastructure of what's happening in the village as well. And the examples can be more. Other human capitals that you would...
Maybe some networks, let's say foreign diasporas include gateways or...
Yes, you can have networks, social groups, which can be to support, give resilience. If you have a dancing club, which are ways to keep community and the socium alive and going. You can have religious groups, not to undermine the importance of religion in forming a community. So if all of this is distorted, one is more, one is less, it affects our daily life. If there is no university today, for some it will be employment problem, for the others it will be what to do with my time. So it changes the infrastructure, it changes our lives and our routines.
But these are examples of social capital.
These are examples of social capitals, I agree. Yes, this is right. This is more of a social capital of religion, including as a big example. Okay, I take it. Physical capital, you mentioned buildings, housing, and this is one of the problems. Again, we spoke about IDPs, and I know many of us in the room have in mind on what's happening in Ukraine. So if you lose your property, it affects how you allocate your resources. Still you need a shelter first, and then you start speaking about school, healthcare, etc. So property, streets, roads, transportation, sewage, the whole infrastructure that exists in rural, and when there is a conflict, when the infrastructure is cut, that one part of the road stays here, the other part of the road stays there, both parts become dysfunctional. If you have a healthcare facility, primary here, secondary there, and it's affected, it becomes dysfunctional. So it's physical capital is a big investment that when it's interrupted, it is affected a lot.
But at the same time, you could use physical assets for exchange. Because the role of natural exchange increases incredibly during the conflict.
Yes.
Sometimes, if it's not real estate, you can just change your car instead of
You can use it, and this is the last part in the paper that I'm not going to reflect today, but it speaks about not only like what can be the assets, it also speaks about in case of which vulnerability, because everything is very individual, what can be done to balance, and what's the role of humanitarians and development organizations to balance the erosion of the pandemic. So ideally, let's say it has to be something like this, but as a result of conflict, what we will have is you may have lots of cash coming in as a part of a development project, cash distribution, or you can have lots of food distribution, and you can have natural assets completely cut, for example, mines, and you cannot harvest anything. You can have health infrastructure. So all of this is subject to all kinds of erosion in the case of armed conflict. Okay? So to have an assessment of vulnerabilities, what we need to do is we need to understand initial structure of assets, of the 5 assets. And again, it's just one way of measuring the vulnerabilities of population to build the humanitarian project. So this is one part. This is analyzing only the assets. The second part that we will go is transforming structures and processes. So, speaking only about the assets, we will not manage to understand if we are delivering enough, because assets by itself, like having a hospital, it's not saving the situation, or having the money doesn't give you the health care. So there are needs to have structures, there are needs to have policies, systems to be able to make the assets functionable. And we speak about the structures. I brought examples of the structures here. Of course, it can be a longer list. And again, it's very individual to different contexts. In South Sudan, for example, where we're working, jurisdictional is not really a structure. It's just you do whatever you do, you're in the bush. Whereas in Ukraine, when we are working, there's like a law, a piece of legislation on everything. So you invest a lot of time going to notarial offices on every corner. So it depends on the context, on where you are. So political structures, this is the local administration, the government, administrative government, municipal government. They all have their budgets, they all have their functions, and they may appear or disappear or get transferred to somewhere else. So we need to make an assessment of this. Executive, again, we speak about governance. Political is more about political governance. This is more administrative governance. Legal part, legal structure on who makes decisions. It doesn't have to be courts. In the case of Ukraine, of course, we're speaking about courts, but in other places you have elders groups, you have mediation groups, you have women's groups who make judgments. In some places where imams make the decision, in other places other religious leaders make the decisions, etc. You have the commercial enterprises for business sector. There is not much I can say here, but business sector is very influential over changing things, especially when business sector is strong and the administration is not very strong. So business sector can dictate policy, can dictate law. So it's very important, but I don't have much expertise on it. Civil society, international organizations, international donors, activist groups, depends on which level of civil society, and of course the health structures. So all of these deserve a good analysis and policies, because having those also doesn't mean that we have healthcare, or if we have an executive body, it doesn't mean that it can be functional, because you can have an executive administration, but an informal leadership where a local authority can be more powerful in running decisions than the judge or the head. And the last part is already about processes, that we need to understand what are the main processes that will dictate transformation of livelihood analysis. So we have the policies. Health policies, if we take in a country, there is a health policy to have free health care, a policy to have free educational system, or if there are not these policies. Markets, legislation, regulatory policies, social norms, and under social norms we will speak about the role of religion. In certain cases we will speak about the In certain moments we will speak about gender, we will speak about age, we will speak about castes in different contexts. In India, social norms will be dictated by caste, whereas in other places by class, or by seniority of older people, or men, or educated people, etc. So it's very fluid again. And the power relations between the ages, between the classes, between the businesses, etc. So before going, I would like to go back to this structure. So to analyze the vulnerability, we will need to analyze the pentagon of assets on what the people had and what do they have right now. Because examples are, you will lose schools for sure, you will have migration, you will have qualified labor moves away, you will have more older people. Mining is a big issue, for sure there will be mines, you will have heavy militarization, you will have jobs moving from corporate to military jobs, you will have money going not into development, but money going into military. So the whole assets are changing. We have transformation of structures and we have transformation of processes, which in itself will give us the vulnerability of the context. So if we have analysis of these two, we will know what are the vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities, Ukraine, UN speaks about winterization. So if you lost your property and it's minus 15 degrees, the first vulnerability is the sheltering that we're speaking about. In Darfur, vulnerability, there was a targeted attack on women who would go out to collect charcoal to come back. In South Sudan, it's a livestock because people lived on having cows and the milk of the cows and the meat of the cows. So you want to attack the community, take away their cows, the livestock. So from context to context, it's different. And what are the structures and processes? There are initial government infrastructure, regulatory bodies, etc. But they also do transform during armed conflict because priorities change from having 100% vaccination to having big military across the border for conflict. So where the money goes, priorities change, and changes also the structure. Okay, so this is the livelihood analysis that we always do as humanitarians to understand the vulnerabilities, to build our humanitarian response accordingly. It depends on which field is your response. If it's a medical, if it's protection, if it's water and sanitation or nutrition, then accordingly you adjust your programs. All right?
So this model, theoretically, it sort of presumes that all of those capitals are of equal value, like the way it's shown here. So I imagine in some countries you would have that, let's say, a very strong banking system and natural resources which are not very developed. Then let's say the damage, yeah, this is the idea, but so in the imaginary Switzerland, let's say the damage through the banking system would impact the country's livelihood much stronger than the, loss of agricultural lands, let's say. And by showing that one of these capitals shrink, you don't show anything because one of them initially was much stronger than the other.
Well, it's never so perfectly equal from the beginning. So from the very beginning, that's why you need to do like a benchmarking study. You need to do a benchmarking of before the armed conflict, how the things were, so that you measure the impact of armed conflict and the vulnerabilities after the armed conflict. Yes, in Switzerland, the banking system is big and there is no industry. So if you target banking system, it will affect much more, and more will be affected on the livelihoods of populations as well. So because it is never perfect like this, it is just
so you adjust
a painting, yes.
And how do you know what was before? Because conflicts usually start unexpectedly and very low. How do you measure what was before?
Well, when you do assessment in general, you know basically where to look at, and the people will say, okay, I lost my house. So you know that the housing is also not equal, and there are communities where everybody lives separately, communities that 3 generations live together. So it is through your not even quantitative, but more of a qualitative analysis that will lead you to understanding what are the impacts.
So you want to do interviews with people?
You can do interviews, desk study will give you a lot already, and you can complement it with interviews.
Actually, my question was, what are the benchmarks that you use to assess the vulnerability? And as you mentioned, priorities are changing, and it is time-consuming to conduct some studies or interviews and to do it with this.
As a benchmark for vulnerabilities, you have different minimum standards that you can speak about, which are the minimum standards of when it becomes like out of control humanitarian assistance. So there are minimum standards in humanitarian assistance. It was filed in early 20th, I think like 90 something. It's called Sphere Standards, and it focuses on 4 main fields, which is healthcare, and there are healthcare standards of how many person is admitted in the hospital, the vaccination coverage in the country, so you know that what you expect, maternal mortality, life expectancy, infant mortality, so there are minimum standards that you follow. For nutrition, you know how many calories one has to consume, like you already know that if there is no meat, if there is in the dietary requirements, there is water and sanitation, how many liters the person consumes per day, and if there is clean water, because there are projects that you go and the main problem is having clean water, because there is a spread of cholera, and there is protection. And as I spoke, protection is not the protection with guns. In humanitarian language, when you speak of protection, you speak of everything that gives a dignity to an individual. So my pension is my protection. So if I lose my pension, I lose my protection. So in humanitarian language, having housing, having warm blankets, having money to buy food is protection. So when they do food distribution, under protection, or when they do sexual and reproductive health, protecting against sexual violence, this in humanitarian language is protection, it's not a military protection. But there are minimum standards of below which it's unacceptable, which are orange lights that you have to be seriously aware and afraid, and more acceptable things. Malnutrition assessments, when you know how many children are underweight, how many children are stunted, how many children are malnourished. You have your indicators. It's in Sphere guidelines. MSF has its own for healthcare. It's a bit adding a few more liters to a person to water. Like how many toilets should be available for how many persons. Like in emergency context, for example, 30 people should have access to 1 toilet. If it is less than 1 toilet for 30 people, you can say that it's a crisis because the probability of these 30 people getting the disease and spreading very fast is very high. So there are minimum standards. It's called Sphere protocols, Sphere minimum standards. Other questions?
Also, so what are the sources of data that you rely on?
The sources of data, well, in a way going back to the question of Ilona as well, the truth is when you're doing humanitarian assistance, you're not really sending a team to do a research and the interviews, etc. So, if let's say you are in a refugee camp and you have to do assessment, I don't know, you have to understand how many people you're talking about. Sometimes what I have done also, you measure, you see how many people they are. You walk up, down, you walk this way, and then you say approximately this many people in square meters. You go to count graves to understand the population. If you have a big graveyard, you can say. So in emergency situations, you cannot do an academically reliable and valid research to understand where your data is coming from. And there are indicators that give you early signals. You have 5 cases of measles in one day, you go out and you say there is measles outbreak, because you can imagine there are many more out there. So, how far you call it the data in a university structure, I'm not sure. But these are, let's say, hints, indicators for you to react. It's not academically solid, reliable data at all for you to make conclusions that you have this problem or that problem.
And one more question regarding analysis, but from the other part, from the part of impact. Because always if you have humanitarian project or international technical aid project, the main thing in the end is to measure the impact. How are you doing it?
Well, in general, I will say how in humanitarian sector it's done, and then I can give more detail about how it's done in MSF. So in general, humanitarian aid, you have to set your indicators from the beginning. For example, when you're doing a cholera intervention, your first day minimum, or in a refugee camp, you say your first day, 30 liters of water per person is acceptable. The second day it has to be 50 liters of water per person, because you know that it will deteriorate if you keep the same level. How at the very end you do evaluation of humanitarian projects, which has its toolkits and mechanisms of how you do evaluation of humanitarian projects. Depending if it's in the field of nutrition, then you're measuring prevalence of moderate acute malnutrition, not to go very technical. If it is in health project, depends on what field of health project. Mortality is the key. Mortality is the number of people who passed away in health facility during after 24 hours of admission. So there are before 24 hours of admission and after 24 hours of admission, because if you bring somebody very sick and the person dies, you cannot say that the hospital didn't do a good job. If you bring somebody that took a long time, then it was the hospital who didn't manage to put the person back to normal. So there are health indicators that you will use in health projects. In nutritional projects, you will use for children, malnutrition, for mothers, pregnant mothers, and lactating mothers. It's another story with different indicators. In water and sanitation, it's the quantity of clean water, availability of latrines, availability of soap, etc. In protection, protection is very wide, starting from sexual and gender-based violence to blankets, to housing, to schooling, so it all comes under protection. But you have to be more targeted to use indicators. SPHERE is minimum standards, so you have to ensure this level at least, whereas for health, nutrition, and water and sanitation, they are more specific on what you are targeting. But again, humanitarian aid is not as research-driven. We want empirical evidence, and we want to make decisions which are product of empirical evidence, but it's not always possible because you can retrospectively reflect on the patients that when you have a disease, for example, cholera, which kills in 8 hours, you have to rely on your intuition a lot. Do you have more questions?
do you have any specific insight about your experience in Ukraine? What's the most, alarming problem regarding the humanitarian aid here in Donbass, for example?
What is the problem in general? I cannot really say. I can say about our projects on what we are doing in the government control side along the contact line. We're running 25 right now, but we're trying to reduce mobile clinics, providing primary medical care and mental health counseling.
Why do you want to reduce it?
We are reducing it because, first of all, we noticed that Ministry of Health is scaling up its activities. There are reforms happening. There are different schemes of subsidized drugs. So the country is moving forward, and we are right now in the phase of reflecting on our pertinence and how we could be more effective and more complementary to the situation today. Because we started our project at the peak of the armed conflict and reaching out to the most remote communities, providing primary health care was the issue then. The issues have changed.
But it's only for government control. How about not government control?
We don't work in the non-government.
But but sometimes you do, right? You mentioned other countries. You said.
Well, as I said, we speak to everybody. We have no problem to speaking to any party because our funding is also not coming from a government who tells us who to deal with. But we speak to everybody. If there is access, we do. In Syria, we have been accused of working only in opposition side. It's because we didn't get access to the government's side of Syria. So if there is opportunity, the objective of MSF is always to ensure to be on both sides of the conflict, to be neutral, and address the needs rather than the politics. So in humanitarian work, there is a humanitarian space concept, which is not about access to physical space, is to have the right to do your own independent assessment. So not to go to non-government control site for the sake of going there, but you go there, you do your assessment, you do your conclusions that the needs are to treat patients at the surgical wards, or the needs are to treat only children, and you do what is needed rather than you do what you are told to do. So we try to make sure that we respect humanitarian space and we do what is needed rather than what we are told to, or what we are paid for, and to be on both sides of the conflict. It's not always possible.
But do you hire local physicians, or how does it work in terms of
all
staff?
our staff is, most of our staff, generally it's something like 10% of MSF staff internationally is international staff. The rest is local staff.
But they are paid.
Of course.
And they have to quit their main job. If they have to, let's say somebody is working as a physician, so they have to quit and then they become sort of...
Yes, if somebody works for MSF, we don't allow to do two jobs because there is a conflict of interest. All the healthcare services provided by MSF is free. And if you have your private clinics next to MSF clinic, chances are you would tell your patient in the private clinic to come to your place in the evening. So we always try to remunerate our doctors to keep them motivated in public healthcare system. As an organization, we believe in the availability and accessibility of free healthcare, at least for basic healthcare. We are not speaking about complicated surgeries, we're not speaking about plastic surgeries, but the basic vaccination should be available and free for everyone, and the basic life-saving medicine. I think it's a shame that people die of pneumonia in our age. That's true. You can follow our activities in Ukraine, both on Twitter and Facebook. Anna is the one who's doing it. Well, thank you very much for coming. If you have no more questions. And on 30th, we have a topic on gender, culture, conflict, and age. How people are affected by gender, by age, because we spoke about livelihoods, and armed conflict is a very gendered topic. So, who gets the food in the family, who gets the education, who makes the decision to stay there, or who is the one who is responsible to take care of child's health. But it's very gendered issues. And age is the issue of our time, with the urbanization, with the demographic shifts, and how we have often elderly people left behind when the youth migrates, and how do elderly cope with livelihood strategies. This will be the topic for 30th of January.
You mentioned some articles you've sent before. Are they available for the people somehow? Or you will send them?
I sent to those who registered. I can send.
Okay. There are 5-6 articles. I have to say most of the articles, except from this one, which is like a framework, more guidebook to use. The rest are more theoretical. It's mind-provoking, it's interesting, but also quite theoretical. If you want to have a look. All right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.